So this is the beginning of chapter 6 of the Sallust text, starting on page 18. And Sallust actually starts with an object, urbem Romam, accusative case. So we could actually start with this phrase, sicuti ego acepi. This means as I have received, or as I have learned. Sicuti means just as, or just like. And it's a synonym of other Latin words like sicut, velut, veluti, things like that. And when Sallust says, as I have learned, he is indicating to us that he is drawing on or using the work of other earlier historians. He's drawing on a historical tradition. Now, one thing that's interesting about the way that Sallust presents the very early history of Rome is that he doesn't include Romulus, who is famously the founder of Rome. He is the eponymous founder of Rome. Eponymous means that he gives his name to the city. And Remus, his brother, is absent from Sallust's version as well. And it's interesting that, there's an ancient commentator who writes about Sallust called Servius. And Servius tells us that Sallust is using an earlier historical work called the Origines, the Origins, by Cato the Elder. And but here there is a difference between Sallust and what we know about Cato, because what Cato does is he takes the two foundation stories of Rome, the Aeneas story on the one hand, the Romulus story on the other hand, and harmonizes them. In other words, he fits them together. He makes Romulus a descendant of the Trojan Aeneas. Whereas Sallust, even though in some ways he might be using Cato, in this particular moment, he really ignores Cato. He goes a different way because he just ignores Romulus and Remus, and he suggests that soon after, the Trojans arrive in Italy and unite with the people he calls the Aborigines, the original or native inhabitants of the region. Pretty soon after that, the city is founded. So rather than this idea that the Trojans arrive and then a few hundred years later, Romulus founds the city, in Sallust's version, instead, you have the Trojans arriving and then very soon after that, Rome being settled with no mention of Romulus and Remus. Okay, so let's go back to the text then. So as I have learned, sicuti ego acepi, and then the subject is Trojani. Right, so Trojans, in the beginning, initio, ablative for time when, the Trojans in the beginning founded, condidere, and had or possessed or held, habuere, and then the object is urbem Romam, the city of Rome. And these verbs, by the way, condidere and habuere, these are not actually infinitives. These are shortened versions. They're technically called syncopated forms of the perfect tense, third person plural. So in more normal Latin prose, you'd have condiderunt. And then similarly here, habuerunt. Okay. And then we have this word qui. Now, qui is clearly referring to the Trojans. In my translation, I had to repeat the word Trojans because it was hard to, it's harder in English to leave the subject till the end as you can in Latin. So Trojans who? And then we have this ablative phrase, Aenea duce, literally with Aeneas leader. Right? Ainea is the ablative of Aeneas, and Duce is the ablative of Dux. So with Aeneas as their leader. And then the verb is vagabantur, were wandering. That's a deponent verb in the imperfect tense. Were wandering. Profugi as refugees. And then we have an ablative phrase, sedibus incertis, with uncertain homes, right? And they are refugees because they are fleeing the city of Troy that has just been sacked by the Greeks, according to legend, which Sallust seems to accept. Cumque his, and with them. And then we need to sort of imagine a verb here, like were joined or something. With them were joined the aborigines. And just pausing for a moment, the aborigines are the people who were already living in this region, in Lazio or Latium. And different historians had different views on the origins of these aborigines, right? Cato, in his book Origines, he said that these natives were actually themselves earlier immigrants from Greece, right? They had immigrated from Greece before the Trojan War, whereas you have others like Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who had a different view, who thought that these natives were autochthonous. In other words, they really belonged in that region. They had never lived anywhere else. They were complete natives, if you like. In some versions, literally born out of the earth. Okay, so with them were joined aborigines, who are described by Sallust as a genus hominum agreste. Agrestis means rural or rustic, and here it's neuter, agreeing with genus, so a rustic race of men, so hominum is genitive plural. Sine legibus, without laws, sine plus ablative, sine imperio, without government. Liberum atque solutum, free and literally solutum is a PPP that means loosened or unfastened or untied. So we might say unrestrained or something like that. And again, these words are neuter, agreeing with genus. And you might notice here again, we talked a bit before about chiasmus, right? Sallust likes chiasmus, which is an ABBA structure. And that's what you have here, right? You've got an adjective, that's A. And then on this side, you've got adjectives again, that's A. And then in the middle, you've got these two sine plus ablative phrases, sine legibus, sine imperio. So that gives you this A, B, B, A structure. So that's something that Sallust likes to do. And it gives a nice sort of balanced quality, a nice harmonious quality to the phrase. Okay. And then in the next sentence, postquam, after these men, he, referring to the Trojans and the Aborigines, after these men, or these people, came together, convenere, this is a sort of archaic or poetic version of convenerunt, perfect tense, third person plural. After these came together in una moenia, literally into one walls, you could say into one set of walls or into the same walls. And then here we have a series of ablatives, dispari genere, literally with different race. In English, we might insert a word like though, and also in English, we wouldn't perhaps say with different race, we might say of different race. So though of different race and of different language, dissimili lingua, and they are described as living, viventes, unus alio more, literally another person with another custom. In other words, one with one custom, the other with another custom. So in other words, they live by different customs. It is, est, incredibile memoratu. It is incredible to recall. That's literally an ablative, sort of incredible with recalling or something. But in English, we would use the infinitive. It's incredible. It is incredible to recall how easily, quam facile, they merged or coalesced or united, coaluerint. And that's in the subjunctive mood because we're in an indirect question. The direct question would be, how easily did they merge? But this is an indirect version of that. It is incredible to recall how easily they merged. So Sallust's point is that it's really remarkable that these two different groups were able to unite easily, given that they had, they spoke different languages, they were different races, different ethnicities or something, and also had different customs. Okay, and then we have this phrase, which is in a sort of brackets, a sort of set of brackets, which we'll talk about. Now, brevi here is ablative for time within which. And we are missing, Sallust is assuming a word like tempore. So brevi here means in a brief time, and ita means such, or something like that. So in such a brief time, a multitudo, that means a crowd or a multitude, divorsa atque vaga, diverse and wandering. Divorsa would be diversa in more normal Latin. So in such a brief time, a diverse and wandering crowd had been made, facta erat, or had become, pluperfect tense. In fact, no, here let's say had been made, pluperfect passive, had been made a community, civitas, by harmony. So concordia here is ablative of instrument, right? This has been done by harmony. Okay, now, why is this phrase in these kind of rather strange brackets? I've put a little explanation in a comment here. The reason that we put this phrase in brackets is because it is lacking in the best manuscripts, right? It's not in the best manuscripts that we have of Sallust's text. But the reason that we put it in the text anyway is because in one of St. Augustine's letters, he quotes this text and he includes this, this bit here. And so we think possibly this phrase existed in an older manuscript of Sallust, which St. Augustine knew or had access to, but has now been lost in between the time of St. Augustine and the present day for us in 2020. Also, we do have a 5th century AD papyrus fragment of Sallust's text, which does include this phrase with a slight change. It has facta est instead of facta erat. So really, we don't know whether this phrase belongs in Sallust's original text or not, and that's why we put it in the brackets. Okay, moving on then to page 20. Okay, sed postquam, but after. And then here we have res. Now, res eorum literally means their thing, the thing of them. But here we are talking, I think, about a community, right? Like res publica, for example. So, but after their community, having grown, aucta, perfect participle from augeo, having grown in, and now we have three ablatives, in citizens, in customs, moribus, and literally in fields, agris, although you could translate agris as territory. So after their community, having done that, was seeming, videbatur, prosperous enough, satis prospera, or you could say fairly prosperous, and satis pollens, and fairly strong. And then Sallust says, sicuti, just as pleraque, the majority of mortal things, so mortalium is neuter genitive plural, the majority of mortal things are held, habentur, and a more natural English translation of habentur would be turn out, right? So just as normally happens in human life, invidia, envy, grew, orta est, right? Perfect of orior, a deponent verb. Envy grew ex opulentia, out of opulence or out of wealth. In other words, the more wealthy Rome became, the more its neighbors were jealous of it. Okay, so therefore, igitur, reges populique, kings and peoples, and they're described as finitumi. In more normal Latin, that would be finitimi, and that's an adjective that means neighboring or nearby. So nearby, neighboring kings and peoples. And if we read if we read Livy or someone, we can find out who these peoples are, right? The Sabines or Sabini, the Aequi, the Rutulians or Rutuli, the Volsci, right? All these sort of Italian tribes. So neighboring kings and peoples, temptare. Now, temptare means were testing them. So it's an infinitive, but this is a use of the infinitive that we call the historic infinitive, which means that you translate it like an imperfect tense verb. So imagine that it's, instead of temptare, imagine that it's temptabant. And similarly with esse here, imagine instead of esse, it's erant. And then we're also missing an object. So we have to supply a word like eos as well. So neighboring kings and peoples were testing them, temptabant eos, in war, bello, ablative case. And then in English, we would put in a word like whereas, pauci ex amicis, few out of their friends, esse or erant auxilio, were there to help. This auxilio, this is what we call a dative of purpose. So few of their friends were there for a help. In other words, to help them. And then Sallust tells us why this was the case. He says, for the others, nam caeteri, metu per culsi, struck by fear. So metu is the ablative, meaning by fear, and per culsi is a PPP, struck by fear, were away, aberrant, or kept away, a periculis, from the dangers. Okay. And then Sallust gives us a big contrast between these rather feeble Roman allies and the very strong and impressive Romans themselves. At Romani, but the Romans, intenti, alert, focused, domi militiaeque, at home and on campaign. And then we have a whole number of historic infinitives, which again, we sort of need to imagine that these are imperfect tense verbs. So for example, imagine that we have festi na bant, and para bant, and horta bantur, and ye bant, and tege bant, right? Imagine that all of these are imperfect tense verbs. So what were they doing? They were hurrying, festinare, they were preparing, they were encouraging, hortari, alius alium. You know, one man was encouraging the other man. In other words, they were encouraging each other or one another. They were going, ire, obviam hostibus. Obviam plus dative means against someone. So they were going against the enemy, fighting against the enemy, and defending, tegebant, literally covering, but we might say defending, with weapons, armies, ablative case, their liberty, libertatem, their homeland, patriam, and their parents, parentis. And this word parentes, this is a kind of archaic or poetic form for parentes. So it's actually accusative plural because it's another object. And notice here you have this tricolon of liberty, homeland, and parents. Okay, and then moving on, we have this word post, which means afterwards. Again, in a more in a less archaic Latin, this would be postea. Okay, so afterwards. Ubi. Now, ubi means when, but in this case, I think the idea is whenever, because Sallust is not talking about a specific occasion here. He's talking about many occasions. So, and he could have used a subjunctive here, but he didn't. So whenever they had repelled, propulerant, pluperfect tense, whenever they had repelled dangers, pericula, with their excellence or with their courage or with their prowess, virtute, ablative case, they used to bring portabant. Now this is imperfect tense because it's a repeated action in the past. They used to bring helps, auxilia. Latin uses the plural here, but in English it's probably more natural to use the singular, help. They used to bring help to their allies and to their friends. Sociis atque amicis, dative case. And que, they used to do something else as well. They used to parabant amicitias. Literally, they used to prepare friendships. In English, we might say they used to establish friendships. And then we have two gerundives here, dandis and accipiundis. Right? Dandis means by giving, from dare. And then magis quam means rather than, and accipiundis means by accepting or by receiving, and then beneficis means favors. Now, beneficis, the favors, are the object here, so you'd expect them to be in the accusative case, but they're actually ablative because of this feature of Latin called gerundive attraction, where the noun is attracted into the case of the gerundives. So the whole phrase, by giving favors, goes into the ablative case. And Sallust's point is that, you know, the Romans are forming alliances by giving favors rather than by receiving them. And that's good, because if you've given lots of favors, you can call them in later. Right? If you've done favors for lots of other tribes, you can later tell them that they owe you. Whereas if you form alliances by asking a stronger group for help, then you're always in debt and you can never really grow. So Sallust thinks that this is one of the secrets to Rome's success.